Okay, everybody, welcome to the Marshall Hangout. I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Ulcca Joshi Hansen, and I apologize now for misspelling her name on the flyer. I should know better. I have known her a very long time. I'm really pleased to welcome her to come and speak to us. I think she has some really interesting things to share, and that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to pass it over to Ulcca.
Oh, that was really quick. I was like expecting a couple of extra minutes. So I don't know where everybody is, but good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you happen to be. It's super fun to be here. I have Jason on, who was in my class. So like this time 20 years ago, we were all kind of waiting with bated breath about what was going on. And we started in 2001 at Oxford. And the presentation I'm going to do today, I don't know how many Marshalls get to sort of like pull directly from the work that they were doing when they were at Oxford for the work that they do every day. But I would say that my life and my sort of professional path actually had me on the outskirts a little bit more of education and the thinking. And I would say in the last like 3 to 4 years, this notion of liberatory education that I was working on while I was there has become a much more central part of the conversation. So it's kind of fun to be able to pull back. And it's great to do the Marshall. I've been doing the scholar selections for, Mary, I don't know how many years, but 3 or 4, and it's 4. And so now it's great to kind of see how people go. So I'm going to share my screen. And I would love to, if you don't mind in the chat, just if you wanted to put like what your connection to education is, or why you wanted to come to this presentation. Is it kind of a professional connection? Is it that you're a parent? Is it that you used to work in education? That would just be interesting for me to know. I'll plan to kind of present for the first part. If you have questions as I'm moving through it, feel free to send them in. And then I think we're going to open it up to questions more generally. So can everyone see the slide deck? I'm just kind of nod or hands up or something. Okay, great. So just a little bit about me first. What I want to do is talk a little bit today about like my work in the work in the field, and sort of why I'm committed to this work, how liberatory education is different from past efforts at reform and innovation, which I think have been the central work of the last kind of 2 to 3 decades, and then what I think it's going to take for us to move out of those models, move those models out of the margins and more into the center of what's going on in education. And I think COVID and the entire global experience that we're having right now is one of those moments. Some people, we use the word paradigm way too much, but a paradigm is actually just the shared context that all of us live inside of, and paradigm shift. And I think for those futurists and people who sort of look at long-term trends, something about what's going on with COVID and in communities and countries around the world right now makes it feel like we're in one of those moments where paradigm could be dying. And the question is, what are we going to do with it? So a bit of background, I'm a third culture kid. That was a new term to me, but it is a child who grows up in a culture that's different from their parents, and then spends a formative part of their growing up years in a different culture or two. And so I was born in the US, but I grew up with relatives in Tanzania, in Arusha and Tanzania, in a kind of community that was mostly Indian and sort of very deeply steeped in Indian, but then also local African kind of communities. Came back to the US for school, but then during high school spent a couple of years studying in France and in Germany. And so during that time sort of went to school and was educated and just sort of felt and lived into different cultures. And it's relevant because I think I'm in my 40s now, my mid-40s, and there's something about life, it's interesting to kind of see how we're all connected to our past, like this idea of generational memes and the things that shaped how we see and understand the world. And as I reflect back on things, I remember growing up, my parents were immigrants. They kind of did that dance that many immigrants in the US do. They came here for their kids and for our education. but they also kept a lot of the kind of traditions and ways of living that they had grown up with as Tanzanians and Tanzanian Indians. And so I remember being super embarrassed. I had to take my lunch in a brown paper bag, and I had to fold up the bag and bring it home every day. And we used to take, baths. We used to fill up a bucket, and it was a small bucket, and we would take a shower out of a bucket. And I remember being super embarrassed about those things. And as I got older, I realized there was a lot about how I grew up and my family that reflected values that were sort of part of a more ecological, communitarian, sort of holistic way of viewing the world and our relationship with it. And it felt very much in tension in many ways with the kind of dominant American culture that I grew up with in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And the same thing happened at school. So my parents brought me to this country. I went to school. I had some amazing teachers. But my parents were not college educated. My mother didn't graduate high school. So they really considered learning to be something that was about the individual, about learning to live in the world, learning through living, as opposed to just the kind of stuff that we did in school. And I had teachers at the time who really kind of fostered that. So I had teachers who let me follow my interests and do projects. I happened to be really interested in things like extrasensory perception and witchcraft and kind of history of witches and things like that. And I had teachers who actually let me follow those passions, kind of passion projects. And they ultimately resulted in an interest that I had in the brain, what we know about the brain, how the brain operates, how we learn, the history of ideas, particularly in Europe, and as they kind of related to the rest of the world. And so when I went into teaching, I thought teaching was going to be what I had experienced. And I started teaching in New York in the late 90s. And that was not it. New York was driven at the time with very, very much, for those of you who are in the US, the kind of race to the top standards. It was reading, it was writing. It wasn't really about paying attention to children as whole human beings, really allowing them to follow their passions. And so everything that I conceived of education to be was in tension with what I was being asked to do. And so I actually left. I worked for a foundation for a couple of years, and then I went to Oxford. And when I came to Oxford, I was really interested in kind of different models of education, some of which I'd experienced, like Waldorf, Montessori, Krishnamurti education in India, but other models that seem to be so different from the dominant model of education in the US. And so I spent the better part of 3 or 4 years studying kind of the history of science. I was a philosophy major, and so I was kind of going back in and through the history of science and how ideas had kind of emerged in Europe that it turned out had shaped our notions of what education were. And so that's where I'm going to start. Obviously, I am simplifying a lot of history and a lot of constructs for the sake of ease, but also because sometimes we need to sort of have those constructs and frameworks to be able to kind of understand some of the assumptions that underlie all of our thinking, and we're not even aware of them. So the two divergent worldviews, you could think of them as a Cartesian, Newtonian, kind of post-Enlightenment, modern European worldview. The other is kind of a holistic, ecological, indigenous worldview. Now, I had to take a class in high school called Modern European History, and it was one of my worst classes because there were so many names and so many dates, and they never told the story in a way that stuck. So it was kind of ironic that I spent 2 years reading about this. But I'm gonna just take a really quick kind of journey through it to set the stage for the education stuff. But before the 1500s, the dominant worldview in Europe was a mystical, sort of organistic, an organic view, right? So we didn't have the scientific knowledge we had today, but people had this deeply held knowing that the spiritual world, the material worlds were interdependent, and that human beings were somehow part of this in a way that was really integrated. And then comes the scientific revolution that spanned kind of from the 16th to the 18th centuries. And during that time, part of what was happening through science, but also through kind of advancements in the papacy and the monarchy, was that this foundational idea of an organic, living universe and world was replaced by the idea of the world as a machine, right? It was a metaphor that continued to dominate Western world and thinking through the modern age. So some of the key figures in the scientific revolution, right, included people like Galileo Galilei, right, who said scientists should study measurable, quantifiable properties of material bodies. You don't want subjective things like my experience or taste or sound or feel, because those things aren't real. You had Francis Bacon, and he was really committed to the scientific process. And just to be clear, I am not critiquing the Enlightenment. I'm not critiquing the scientific process. There is a lot of amazing stuff that has been made possible. But there is something about the foundational ideas that I'm going to say have sort of gotten out of control and gotten a little bit too extreme in the way that our societies are organized. Francis Bacon was also the person who had this idea that human beings were separate from nature, that nature can and should be tapped into, and we could dominate it. And there are ecofeminist scholars like Carol Merchant who say that that type of dominating, controlling viewpoint around nature represented like moves away from an ecological integrative attitude towards nature that was much more common in the Middle Ages in Europe and in almost every indigenous community worldwide, right? And it has been the root of a more anti-ecological approach to nature that's dominated extractive industries and the way that we live. And some people also tied these kind of beliefs to sort of anti-feminist ideas, this idea of the goddess declined. Witch burning actually was tied to a really anti-female sentiment that was sort of coming out. Somehow the feminine, which was also connected to the earth and the living earth, was seen as suspect. You had people like Descartes, who was, I think, therefore I am. Right? It was deeply analytic. So our feelings, our experiences were not ways of knowing. The way that we know things is through thinking and through words. Isaac Newton, he thought that the world was a big mechanical system that operated according to mathematical laws. And then there were people like Darwin, who really thought about natural selection and competition. So I'm not drawing a parallel here between what was happening in science and what happened in society, except to the extent that as a philosopher, I can say that before there were discrete disciplines, philosophers were people who were trying to understand the world. And there were a lot of what we now think of as discrete subjects, biology, chemistry, psychology, sociology, that were actually explained by philosophers. And so there was a lot of the philosophers were the scientists as well as the people who were thinking about social systems. And so there were a lot of these ideas from science that ended up being pulled down into understandings about the world and how the world works, including human beings and how human society works. So you had people like John Locke, James Mills, Jeremy Bentham, who tried to apply the principles that were emerging in science to human society. That is literally the idea of social sciences, was the application of these principles. How do we organize and understand complex systems and human beings? So John Locke had a very atomistic view of society. Human beings are sort of these basic building blocks. Patterns come down to like individual behaviors. And he applied these principles to economic and political problems. James Mills and Jeremy Bentham, they were utilitarians. The value of a thing sits in how useful it is. So in an economic system, they helped to shape the industrial era. The industrialists prized efficiency because that was the most important value. And because education, people often think of education as something that sits on top, but I actually think educational systems are often the last things to change, because education is nothing more or less than the replication of existing values into the next generation. And so education in many ways is designed to replicate the dominant values that are held into the next generation. So it's not surprising that the industrial model of education that I think many of us here critiqued and have heard critiqued by people like Sir Ken Robinson and others, emerged out of industrialists who were trying to kind of take these dominant cultural values and apply them into education. So as all this was happening, right, there was a divergent set of worldviews. That was the kind of Cartesian Newtonian view in science was one view of the world. And then there was this other view, which you can think of as holistic, ecological. It had its roots in the pre-Enlightenment era in Europe, but now there were scientific advances in fields like physics and evolution that kind of helped bolster some of the beliefs that had been held during that time. So Einstein, right? This theory of relativity is actually super important. There is no such thing as objective knowledge. Things are interdependent. And so this notion that knowledge is this one set of things and not something else kind of gets called into play. The universe is a web of interrelated connections. We're not building blocks. We can't simplify things down into atoms that operate in certain ways. Darwin and a man named Johann Smuts battled out the notion of evolution. Smuts said, look, if organisms are just these like building blocks and pieces of parts or bits of parts that work together, we're not understanding the integration. People who are in medicine are now, right, we're seeing the complex kind of interplay between parts and systems that if we don't recognize and honor them, we can do great harm. So on the scientific, economic, and social side in Europe, you're having this kind of battle between this Cartesian Newtonian view of science and the holistic ecological piece. And I'll add, I don't know how many of you have read this book by a woman named Jill Lepore, but she does a really interesting job of talking about how as the Europeans were leaving Europe during this time and going out to kind of trade and eventually colonize the rest of the world, there were many battles that were being fought out in the development of new lands, including the United States, that were actually about these competing worldviews, because essentially worldviews birth lots of other kind of ways in which fields operate. So I've just kind of synthesized here, right? You can see this in classical physics versus quantum physics, classical economics versus behavioral economics, geometry, Euclidean geometry and fractal geometry, domination of nature versus ecology and conservation. There are a lot of social debates that we are having right now that at the root go to a difference in our beliefs around the nature of people, the nature of societies, who has power, who doesn't. And if you look at the bottom, right, some of these are really obvious. Unrestrained capitalism versus social capitalism. Colonialism and enslavement, the same mindset that allowed for that was sort of against this notion of indigenous existence. Those people are savages, they're not people, they don't have rights. There's a hyper-individualism that came out of the Cartesian Newtonian worldview versus collectivism. And the last one of paternalistic systems versus more liberatory systems matters when we get into this conversation about education. Because the divergent worldviews in education, I've just summarized this down to kind of 4 big areas. But the industrial model of education versus a more human-centered liberatory approach to education have very different conceptions of the purpose of education. So is it a utilitarian process that's aimed at producing workers and citizens that fit into existing social systems? Or is the purpose to develop individual human beings who can achieve their individual potential? Is a curriculum primarily focused on content knowledge and socially beneficial values that are chosen by usually a dominant, powerful subset of society? Or is the curriculum emphasizing self-knowledge, spiritual development, and individual freedom and agency in addition to knowledge? Is the system designed to improve efficiency of how you deliver education? Or is it an approach that says actually process as well as outcomes are super important and we value both? And then how do we think about the role of community, relationship, the kind of development of human beings in their entirety? And they're very different on those as well. So this is just, you know, there were people in Europe like Montessori and Steiner who were sort of in Europe building out these views of education as an answer and a response to this factory model of education. But really the principles of liberatory human-centered education are exactly how human beings, including in Europe, have always taught their young and brought up the next generation as part of a community, understanding who they are in relationship to others. And to a broader society. So these are just some of the people, but people like Paulo Freire, Big Picture Learning, Kurt Hahn, right? These are some of the other thinkers. I'm just gonna pause there because I think this has really important implications for conversations in education about equity. So I actually really dislike this graphic. I'm not an artist, but I wanna find a third frame, right? The first piece on the left, equality, sort of gets to this notion of equality is about getting everybody to the same place. You're all watching the baseball field. And so equity is about giving you different size boxes to be able to watch the game. I would love a third frame, which has some kids watching the game, some kids walking away, some kids digging under the fence, some kids watching with a drone, some kids painting the fence, right? There are very different things that we might want to do. And is equity in education about getting all kids to the same place? Or is it about getting kids to the place that they want to go and providing them the resources they need to do that, but really honoring in different ways that human beings are different? And so being, Jason, I'm going to say this, but like being a doctor is not better than being a teacher, or it's not better than being a construction worker, right? That different people have different strengths, and we're all going to find our place in the world in different ways. And I'll come back to this question of equity, but to me, multidimensional educational equity has to sit at the individual learner level. And it requires us to think about the human dimension of a child and the academic dimension. From the human dimension, we've got to think about human development. We've got to think about what's important for little humans who are coming from birth into their place in the world, around their self-identity, a sense of purpose in life. Positive psychology shows that's critical. The ability to engage in authentic relationships, being connected with community, having social capital and being able to build on it. And then on the academic dimension, neurodiversity matters. Our brains are different, we are different, we engage with the world differently and learn differently, and that it's okay for us to think about different young people having and forging different educational pathways, and it doesn't mean that it's not equitable, it means that we're sort of honoring the individual. So it's a shift in how we have always talked about equity, because how we've talked about equity has existed inside the factory model of everybody's got to get to one place. I'm just gonna really quickly zoom through this, and I'm happy to come back to any of these slides. But my doctoral work at Oxford resulted in this kind of framework of an instructional model. This might seem super intuitive to those of you who are not educators, but it doesn't seem intuitive in education. But ideally, you would build an educational model or an approach that's grounded in a purpose, that really reflects what we know about human development and learning, that decides what we're going to teach and how we're going to teach things aligned with purpose and learning and development, and then thinks about human capital, so preparing adults to help be the guides and the mentors, and systems that reflect those. I would say the vast majority of ways that we do education do not reflect this. And this came out of a secondary piece of research that I did about 5 years ago. I was really interested in shifting the conversation about choice, at least in the US conversation, away from things like governance models. So in the US, at least, we debate charter schools versus traditional public schools versus private independent schools. And we have these debates about what governance model of school matters. Whereas my theory would be that you don't actually care what governance model you have. You actually care about the orientation of a school to its work. How does it define its primary purpose? How does it think about the developmental needs of kids? How does it think learning happens? And therefore, how do they teach? How do they think about discipline and community building? How do they assess learning? And I was also particularly interested in instructional models and cognitive profiles of learners. So there are sort of cognitive profile elements around how verbal you are, whether you're a visual spatial kind of strengths in those areas, processing speed, working memory, and attentional and affective issues. And for those of us who work in special education, we are often doing evaluations of young people to say, okay, will one model of school work better for you based on who you are and what your cognitive strengths are? And what ends up, this is just sort of a chart that kind of shows, obviously it's a spectrum, it's not buckets, but this is kind of this continuum of schools. And on the far left-hand side, where it says conventional, that would be your industrial model of education. The middle bucket is whole child innovative reform, which I would say has been about 95% of the work and the conversation that we've been having in education over the last 20 to 30 years, at least in the US. We recognize what doesn't work on this far left-hand column, and we try and address it, but we do it by bolting on solutions. So we bolt on a socio-emotional learning curriculum. We bolt on an anti-bullying curriculum. We bolt on project-based learning. We bolt on community engagement. So there are all these little pieces that we try and stick onto the left-hand side model to make it better. The challenge with this is that the entire system buckles under its own weight, because there is so much we are trying to do, but in very disparate ways, and sometimes in ways that are totally counterproductive, that it becomes very difficult for teachers, it becomes difficult for kids, it becomes difficult for systems. And yet this is where we have put our emphasis when we've talked about equity and reform and improvement. And this third bucket is what I would say is human-centered liberatory education that takes a very different approach to the purpose of education. It really doesn't say we're about college prep or we're about academic readiness or career readiness. It says actually we're about creating human beings who have what they need to thrive in life. Part of that is academic, part of that is your job, but it's a whole bunch of other things. And it's incredibly developmentally, it's reflective of human development and the learning sciences. And so the continuum of what it looks like from elementary to middle to high school, you start down here and you're very grounded in what we know young people at those ages and stages need. So you are grounded in relationship to community. With the younger kiddos, it's about helping them develop a sense of independence. With middle schoolers, it's really helping them have a sense of belonging in their community. And then with high school age students, it's about relationship to community with a sense of identity. Who do I want to be when I go into the world as an adult? On the academic side, with the little kiddos, we really think about connectedness. So how are ideas connected to each other? How are they connected to me and my world? In middle school, it's a sense of relevance. I have 2 of these and they're like, why should I care? So it's answering the question, why should I care? And on the right-hand side column, it's a sense of purpose in my education tied to this growing sense of identity. And you'll see that there's much richer, complex work here going into how we do social and emotional learning, how we think about character formation. Social justice is a really important part of this, and it's because in these schools, because they often emerge out of the community and kids are engaged in their communities as part of their learning, they can't help but have conversations about what is going on, what they're seeing, how systems work or don't work. It's not about a political stance, but it is about saying, how are we having conversations about what's happening in our world? And these schools also take a much broader view both of how learning happens, so they are less likely to be the schools where you sit in a seat and have a teacher lecture at you, even if it's a lecture with great PowerPoints and you get to do a little bit of movement. But these are places that do internships, you're doing maker learning, design-based learning, play-based learning. So you're getting to learn in ways that are very diverse and different. And these schools are also the ones that aren't driven by standardized tests and assessments, because the assumption is that knowing can be shown in lots of different ways. It can be shown through movement, through speech, through art, through making things, not only by what I can write and what I can read. And so these are sort of it's a chart, we can come back to this, but there's these major differences between these 3 instructional orientations in terms of purpose, how we think about human development, how we think learning happens, how we teach, how we assess learning. To me, the liberatory kind of piece, or the liberatory column, is where a lot of our conversations are sort of going, if not always overtly, but in our critiques of the current system in terms of what's important, whose voice counts, whose knowledge and stories count, and how young people are allowed to demonstrate their competency and their ability to go into the world. So for me, as we think about educational equity, and kind of racial justice, economic justice, social justice moving out of COVID, for education, it really is about ensuring that every family and child has kind of pathways through these 3 orientations to education so that they can make choices that best fit kind of who their kids are and what they need, right? My bias is that this is far better than this, but I'm not going to impose it on a family if they decide that this is what they want for their child's education. So at the very least, we need to make sure that we have K-12 pipelines available to every child. At the moment, these schools are available in the private and independent sector predominantly, because inadvertently, our reform efforts in terms of more testing, more standardized standards, kind of much less variability in how we teach, all of the efforts that we've made in the public education system to improve that left-hand side model have actually tightened down and made it much harder for schools that take that right-hand side bucket to do their work. So I'll just briefly kind of say a theory of change, right? Back to this slide. Because we are in a moment where we are having conversations in all dimensions of our kind of societal and sort of economic systems, I think it's a moment in education for us to say, look, this is the change adoption curve, right? Inventors are always going to be the small kind of group of people. But in order to get those right-hand side column schools, we need very different approaches to the curriculum, to teaching, to assessment, to accountability, to how we prepare adults. And inventors are always people that are going to invent things outside of the existing system so that early adopters have something to copy and sort of spread, so that early majority adopters can sort of take it and say, oh, this is what it looks like and this is how we can come to it. So right now, we have a moment in our conversations to increase our community will for these sorts of third column schools, to remove policy barriers, and COVID has reduced some of them for us. Kids are not in school. It's not about seat time anymore, that you have to be in school 180 days, 8 hours a day. We have testing systems that are on pause for at least 2 years. I would say accountability systems in the US are probably not going to come back for 3 or 4, because if you don't have data from 2 or 3 consecutive years, it's really hard for you to do. So we've got policy barriers removed. And so it's our moment in communities, in conversations with families, to build demonstration schools, but also the vertically aligned systems that the schools need to kind of do their work. And so this is our moment, I think, if people are willing to get into the conversation about what are these new aligned policy systems that we need, and how can we create space in the public system to do it. In the military, you have DARPA, right? Because the military knows you'll never invent something new inside of the existing system. So in education, can we carve out spaces inside of districts or schools within schools to say you're going to be free from many of the regulations and policies that we have right now, so that you can invent these new aligned systems that reflect those right-hand side column values. Because it's really hard to just tinker with systems that were built out of those left-hand side values, because the DNA of the existing system will always just eat up anything new that happens and sort of make it in its own image. So it's still a choice. I would say there are reasons for optimism in terms of our awareness of inequities and debates around who should be at the table, who should have a say. But they're open questions. And part of the reason that I focus on these like high level, worldview level assumptions that inform what we experience every day. I used to do sexual health education, and we always said knowledge didn't change behavior. Because at the end of the day, we live inside of this like unseen context or stew that really informs the decisions we make when we're not thinking about it, right? It's our default context. And so we have to very intentionally be thinking about the worldviews and the values that are going to undergird our new systems. So do we recognize the nature of the problem we're trying to solve? Will we create the space for invention? And so look for adaptive solutions. And will the people who've been in positions of power cede their place to a new generation of thinkers? So it's going to be really hard, frankly, for the people who've been the leaders in reform and innovation to do something different, because they're not coming at it from a different place. They are coming at it most often with the same toolkit and sets of values and understandings that they've always had. And they're often people that don't reflect the full diversity of the kind of young people and families and communities that need to be served. So I will pause there. I actually can't see any chat questions. So Mary, I'm not sure if I have any, but happy to take whatever questions people might have.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start. Could I ask a question? I wonder how your very appealing educational method maps onto an increasingly tech-oriented world.
So tell me more about that.
Well, the skills that are at the moment highly valued are ones that that fit very well to a tech-oriented world. Mm-hmm. And I wondered how your kind of focus on individual self-realization and a broadly creative, intuitive exploration of potential, individual potential, how does that produce the skills that are most valued at the moment?
Sure. So I gave 2 TED Talks on the future of smart, right? I would say that given technology and artificial intelligence's ability to do a lot of what we have historically considered the valuable skills inside of our conventional system. So even analytic thinking, kind of being able to problem solve, calculate, those sorts of things. In many ways, technology can already do that better and more efficiently than human beings can. Human beings, our comparative advantage, I would say, is our ability to deal with complexity, to deal with the unexpected, to collaborate, to use lots of different skill sets and bring them together in service of solving problems. We are the people who are going to be designing the code that drives technology, and that requires us to be deeply aware of kind of biases and the way the world works. So I would say that in the face of technology, assuming that we're thinking about technology as something that enhances human capability in society, it's more important than ever for human beings to develop the deeply human capabilities that, at least right now, technology, artificial intelligence, et cetera, don't have. And the second part of that, I would say, is everything that we're seeing from the jobs reports, the World Bank, McKinsey, everybody, when you ask them what skills do people need, not which industries are going to go away, but what things, what jobs inside of your industries are going to go away. And they talk about the things that technology will be able to do. The things that they say are going to be left over, I think overlay really well on this idea of young people who know how to learn, know how to kind of assess the value of the information that they're getting, who know the kind of ethical questions to ask, right? What are the impacts when there are competing sets of values? Who know how to collaborate and kind of work with people in teams. And I think neurodiversity plays into this as well. The example I like to use is people who are on the autism spectrum. So in many ways, right, in the 1930s, we were trying to get rid of those folks, but the tech industry has been driven like disproportionately by people who have autistic tendencies, right? So it was something that was not seen as a value at some point, and actually is driving the world as we know it right now. And so I think about biodiversity as being really important to biological ecosystems, and I would say neurodiversity is really important to human ecosystems, especially in the face of complex problems and challenges that we can't yet anticipate. And I think those right-hand side columns value and allow for all of the things I just mentioned to be developed much better than those kind of left-hand side column schools, which are really about compliance, right? And about memorizing and about regurgitating, and don't leave room for those other things.
Thank you.
Ulcca, I have a question for you. So I mean, you talked a little bit about it, but you know, how could this help with a future where we may have lockdowns and different places where homeschooling is the must, and how you might map that on and how that would work? Is it something easier to do in homeschooling because you're not having to obey a national curriculum or whatever it is? I'd be interested to hear your views on that.
So it's funny, I'm taking this call right now from a workspace. It's a collective workspace, and this is a conversation and a project some of us are working on. My answer is yes, I do think. And in fact, we know this because when we look at the schools that were able to pivot much more easily when COVID hit and schools had to close, the schools and the young people that were able to pivot more easily were actually the young people who were in the schools that kind of were in that right-hand side column, because they had always had ownership over their own learning. So it didn't require them to be in a school with a teacher giving them assignments for them to do it. They were able to sort of take ownership, and they'd been taught the skills that they needed to kind of drive their own learning and kind of move it forward. They were the ones who were most easily able to say, I'm home, I have all my time, like these are the things I'm really interested in, this is where I go out in the world and sort of find it. So I think as you, and I think this move towards micro schools, this move towards homeschooling co-ops and young cooperatives of learning cooperatives is growing, in part because I also think we have a generation of young people, and maybe this is always true of every generation, but they are certainly questioning a bit more kind of systems that tell them to kind of do this in the face of realities in the world that they're seeing. And they're like, look, we want to go out, we want to solve problems, we want to be part of our communities and the kind of things that we see wrong in the world that we think we have answers to. And so I think the way the world is at the moment, I think if we are careful about it, right, I think the opposite is also true. There are a lot of people who are just trying to move existing schools online. They're like, here's this app, here's this kind of, you know, stream of videos that kids just kind of go and click through. That is certainly one set of solutions that is being built out right now. But I think the interest in that right-hand side piece is greater today, both from parents, families, and then young people. And I can't tell, like, are you and I just left? Oh, I see, there are non-video participants. There's nobody on here.
There are other people here. There are other people. I wonder how this would map on to also to universities. You know, how do you see, I mean, obviously it starts at the bottom and works its way through. What do you see as a future university looking like?
I mean, I don't know how this is in the UK, but I know there are conversations right now about potentially a quarter of small liberal arts schools kind of going under in the next few years. And I think higher ed has seen this. I think it goes back to your definition of kind of learning and the role of formal learning and formal learning institutions in the kind of life cycle of a human being. And I think what we are going to see more and more is that the universities, certainly, right, there are always going to be pathways where we sort of say, yes, there's a value to going and getting a 4-year degree and then going and doing your graduate work and going deep. But the nature of knowledge and changing knowledge, the nature of industries is that we are much more likely to have people needing to go in and out. So you go, you learn, you get some new skills, you go back out, you get new skills. And so I think universities, many universities are having similar conversations about how do we make the curriculum more relevant? How do we have young people who are developing these human capabilities, right? You're seeing this all over. People are like, young people are coming in, they're not socially like competent, they're not emotionally well, they are not kind of independently and internally motivated, right? You're seeing these particularly at some of some of the institutions that we all are part of. So I think people are having that conversation. I think there are issues in higher ed around, you've invested in faculty, you've invested in these buildings, you've invested in a lot of infrastructure that's going to be hard to change. And at least I've worked with 3 universities that are having these conversations. And it is often the case that there are faculty members who are some of the hardest to move on this, because they're like, this is what I've spent my entire life doing. I come from a place of I'm the expert and I'm the person who's supposed to deliver, and they're finding it hard to pivot. So again, I think COVID may be opening up a moment where as places are facing kind of existential crises, and there are going to be more and more young people who are saying it's not worth $120,000 of debt at 22 to get this degree, that they're either going to have to pivot and change, or they really are just kind of going to winnow down to maybe the research capacity and some of those other pieces that are a core function that they hold.
Ulcca, could I ask? It was a wonderful talk. It's just so good to see you. Can you comment on how those changes might look? You referenced small liberal arts colleges in particular, but how those changes may look in the setting. I mean, in the last, I know the 2 industries where inflation's been like double national inflation is healthcare and education, right? So there have been tremendous increases at the university level, at least in the United States, of the cost of education, and there's starting to be pressure. Like, if my kid's not in Harvard Yard, like, why am I paying $70,000 kind of thing? And so it's hard to know how this is going to play out, but can you comment on some of these cataclysmic changes that may occur in the setting of the financial stresses that these colleges and universities may face?
No, I mean, I think you put your finger on part of the existential threat that I think was happening anyway. And now COVID, with this possibility of, one of the most valuable things that many people find in their undergraduate career is and I think it's one of the images that people have of people's university and sort of post-secondary experience, although ironically, it's not what the vast majority of students experience, but it's this, oh, you go onto this campus and you spend late nights talking about philosophical ideas and like debating and meeting people who are different and whatever. That is actually not the reality for kids who do two-year colleges, who are kind of working while they're in university, et cetera, right? So when you look at the percentage of students that are actually having that experience, it's pretty low. But I think COVID and the fact that people won't be able to get that thing, right? But the irony is that when you think about the things that most people remember and value, it is not necessarily, sometimes it is the amazing professor that you had who like opened your mind and blew open your, but what people think a ton about is who did I meet? How did I get to follow my interests? How did I get to like do this club and that club? What were the skills I learned doing these like independent projects or independent studies? What was I learning about myself and who I wanted to be as I went into the world, right? Those are the things that people remember both in their K-12 education as well as in their higher ed space. And so, and those things don't cost as much, right? I think that's the irony of the increasing costs, even in healthcare. We put the money into, the drivers are often the things that we know are the least central to the success of the industry, right? Or the success of the endeavor. And I think higher ed has done something very similar, right? Let's invest in the football stadiums. Let's invest in, you know, single dorm rooms with bathrooms and you know, eateries that have 50 options, you know, that sort of thing in that arms race. And I think, and this is why, like, you asked me, like, how am I doing? Like, we're all struggling with COVID. And there's been something very interesting, I think, collectively around everybody pausing and taking a deep breath and letting it out and be like, oh my God, the pace of my life was insane. I was in airports, I was traveling, I was never seeing my kids, I wasn't sleeping. So it's almost like there's this big collective inhalation, exhalation that is really scary and really hard. And I am privileged enough to not be as devastated by it as many families, and I understand that. But it is a pause in this like arms race. In a direction that just sort of felt like, well, of course that's what we're doing. So now it's a question of, will we reset? And that's why I keep going back to, will we reset at the level of foundational values? Or will we reset as, oh, we're still gonna have the same values, but we'll just do more Zoom meetings instead of getting on planes? Or we'll, you know, like that type of thing.
So you have some questions in the chat now.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So non-exam modes of assessment might look like. Yes. So when can I ask Dan if you care whether it's in K-12 or higher ed or both? I think there are similarities. And then, is that you, Dan? Hi. Both, okay. So what you see when you go into those right-hand side column schools, so one, you really do see a valuing of different ways of knowing and demonstrating knowing. And you see value put on things that can be shown that you have actually done, not that you kind of know in theory. So you see things like, well, first of all, teacher evaluation and teacher assessment is really important. So educators are watching and they are seeing the growth. So it might not be happening in this linear way. It might not happen on assessment, but they know. Self-assessment is really important. So young people are actually taking ownership of, what did I say I was gonna learn? Have I gotten there? Have I not gotten there? What was the process like for me? How do I improve? You see things like sort of authentic work products. So your project was, you know, these kindergartners were like, we're seeing like garbage in a park and we want to go and make sure there are garbage cans in the park. And so they go and they advocate with the city council and they do the research and they design dustbins that aren't going to be opened by animals. And at the end, it was the authentic work product. Like, you did what you said you wanted to do, and here are the artifacts along the way. You'll often see demonstrations of learning. So young people will be presenting to other young people, to their community, about the things that they're learning. You'll see portfolios and passages. So this kind of like, you know, portfolios of artwork. You're sort of gathering material over time. There's an interesting project called the Mastery Transcript Consortium that's been trying to develop a transcript that really allows young people to sort of put in and document authentic work products, portfolios, passages, that sort of thing. But different modalities of showing your learning are important too. So it's not always the 20-page paper. You could do a graphic novel, you could do a film, you could do a spoken word performance, you could do, right? So again, the sort of valuing for no particular reason other than that we've always done it, of like writing essays and being able to write at the graduate level is, you know, is kind of being put aside in these schools. And it's interesting because in the public sector, at least, a lot of those right-hand side column schools happen to be our alternative high schools. So the only time young people get access is when they've basically been beaten down for 8 years and told that they're complete failures, and then we have alternative high schools for them. And then in the, certainly in the private and independent sector, you see it. And I don't see why the same is not actually true in higher ed. So the places that are trying to move towards learner-centered places are saying, okay, look, you know, often it's designing your own major, or you're pursuing longer term projects. And yes, maybe it's a paper, maybe it's a presentation, maybe it's, I mean, it's much more like kind of what you would think of as higher level graduate work, except maybe with the, it doesn't have to be a 300-page dissertation taken away, but it's an extended body. And there's a value on process too, documentation of process. And that is valued as much as the final output, which again, in the real world, how many of us go from A to Z, whether in research or projects or whatever, with no mistakes, right? It's always about. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think those are some examples. And in terms of accreditation, I think this is one of the challenges, right? Again, that left-hand side column, one of the values that stems from that is it has to be quantifiable, it has to be comparable, and yet those things are really weird to achieve. We somehow think that if we give all kids grades, or they're all taking the same standardized tests or the same AP tests, that it's comparable, even though we know that the inputs were really different. The buildings are different. Some buildings are hot, some places are cold, some people have beautiful windows and air, other kids don't. Some kids come in not having food, right? But we somehow think that what we're seeing is comparable when it's not. And so I think accreditation will end up looking much more like the processes that like Ofsted used to do in the UK, or independent schools do, which is it's collective accountability, which is you get people in who are trying to do the same work you are. They come and see your work, they ask you questions, they see the process, they reflect back what they're seeing, what they see is working or hear is working, where you have areas for improvement, right? And so it's seen as this evolution towards a state of being, not a you are this or that. With obviously some caveats, like you can't be really horrible. And those right-hand side programs are hard to do because they're complex. And the adults who are in them, the people who are guiding and mentoring, have to have a very different set of skills than the ones that we've been valuing. And then Peter, you asked, following interest is motivating, what sort of criteria do you see employers having for selecting new employees? I mean, look, I think part of this is, it will depend in some ways on sector, right? There will be sectors where I think the idea of like, well, I'm going to remake how we make the hamburger, right? At the thing that might not be valued at McDonald's, right? It's like, no, we want to. Although what you are finding is places like Costco and Starbucks, where they actually give employees the opportunity to say, okay, as the person who is working here, what am I seeing? What am I kind of seeing needs to be improved? How do I give feedback, right? Those things are actually valued. I think the biggest thing though is what employers say they want is they want young people who are self-motivated and self-directed. They want young people who know how to do things. And you learn to do things by doing things. So you don't learn to take a project from start to completion and deal with all the things along the way by never doing it. Whereas if I'm following an interest or a passion and I've developed a project that I'm motivated to finish, I then go through that process, finish the process, and I've learned a whole bunch around it. And a good guide or a good mentor or a good teacher is going to be helping me understand that I've learned those skills. And yes, it's true. Sometimes in life you have to do stuff you don't want to do. And I don't want to make it sound like those right-hand side column schools only it's not like chickens with their heads cut off, where they're doing only what they want to do. But the entry point is often their interests and the things that motivate them, so that at the end of the day, you can say, look, sometimes you have to do things you don't want to do. So you have to learn this math thing, or you have to take this exam, but you do it so that you can do the thing you say you want to do down the road and down the line, right? So that I get to work in this place because I love doing this work. And yes, sometimes it means that I have to do X, Y, and Z as well. So I think there's a subtlety, and often it's a both and. The left-hand side column, the mentality is often either or. It's this or it's that. I think the right-hand side column, both the kind of worldview as well as kind of how reality looks inside of it, is often a both and. So it doesn't have to be just one or the other. So from an educational perspective, let's say in the left-hand side column, you'd be like, well, we do direct instruction. That is how you teach. And somehow there's no other modality than that, right? Or if we do, we just tack it on. Whereas in the right-hand side column, you would say, actually, kids learn in different ways. And there might be times when every kid needs direct instruction. So we'll have direct instruction when we need it. We just have this vast set of tools in our toolkit, and we will use them as needed. But I think the important piece is that the entry point is a thing that internally motivates so that you can sort of start them in that process. I hope that helps. Let's see, Jenna, you had a question? You said maybe it was vocalizing it, might be easier.
Yes. Oh, I have about 20 questions, but I'll limit it to just one for now. Thank you. This has been really fascinating. One thing, I've worked at two really, just to preface it, I'm a musician. I'm performing as a musician, but I also do a lot of music education work at the moment. And I've worked at two very unusual schools, which has put a lot of questions into my mind. But one thing I've found myself observing again and again is that often the students who are best at sort of seeing what is expected of them, checking those boxes and fulfilling the expectations of the mentors, the teachers, the system, are often in terms sort of limited by that in their future growth. And often I see that the students who are much more rebellious and kind of refuse to play by the rules are actually really well set up for the kind of success that especially someone in the creative fields, or the kind of skills that someone in the creative fields needs. And I'm really struggling, you know, as someone who cares about my students and someone sort of watching the world, between the contradictions. And I'm wondering if you've observed this and if you have thoughts on how this fits into the systems. I mean, I'll make a quick generalization that too often this seems to fall along gender lines, but not always. And I'm just curious how this, your thoughts on this in general. And then I'll leave you with a sort of a parting question, which was if you could sort of change one thing, let's, you know, just talk about the sort of the US education system in general, or anywhere. If you could put your finger on the scale and change one thing to start a process of change, what would it be?
Well, so let me actually take the last one first because I can do it more quickly. I would, and we're actually talking about this, I live in Denver and the schools are planning to start online 2 weeks later than they were going to. And I'm ripping my hair out because I'm like, no, while the weather's nice, get kids together in cohorts of 10 with their educator. Spend the first 2 weeks to a month of a young person's kind of time at school doing an activity which is a who am I activity. What are my strengths? What are my interests? Where are the areas I struggle? Where are the areas of kind of interest I have? So that educators get to know young people get to know themselves better, and young people get to know the people that they're with. Like, I'm very serious about that bottom triangle of relationship to community and relationship being central to the work that schools do, because inside of relationships, you can make all sorts of things happen that without relationships, you're forced to kind of make it about compliance and carrots and sticks and punishments. So I would, if I had my way, have every young person start off their school experience with like 2 to 4 weeks of really just setting the foundation of relationship to self, to other, and do it. I mean, if you want to do it in, you know, through like Outward Bound or camping or going and doing something that is totally non-educational, but that is about them kind of displaying mindsets, dispositions, and ways of being with themselves and others, that then form the kind of basis. It's the go solo to go fast. If every school and every educator did that, I think we'd see a huge transformation. In terms of your question, at least to me, what you just described, right, about if you spent your we become what we do. If I have spent my entire life playing the game and ticking the boxes, then in a sense, who I am is a person who knows how to play the game and tick the boxes. And when that goes away, I don't know what to do, or it's a struggle for me to like figure out how to navigate. And I will I will say this, having watched and worked with students, including myself, who did the game of school well, there comes this moment when there are no more hoops to jump through that somebody else is deciding for you, and you have to be like, well, wait, what do I want to do? And I know that I have certainly spent periods of my life struggling. I think there are a lot of us in this community and in similar communities that hit that moment where all of a sudden we don't know what to do. So when you say the kids who are more rebellious, the kids who are more, like, I actually go into alternative high schools and I think those kids are phenomenal because they are the ones who have refused to kind of give up who they are and give up and be like, no, you don't get to tell me. Now there's a lot of other damage that's been done, but I think it is those kids who often resist the system because they don't understand why they're doing it. They don't see the point. They're driven, right, by relationships or sort of other things, and they're not getting that in school, and so they're the bad kids. And you're right, those are often, and I don't know if this is gender, I don't know if it's society, I think it's, or biological or socially developed, I think it's probably a combination of both, which I know is controversial, but like I do think that like girls are taught to be more relational and therefore care from a very young age, like they're responding to the social cues in the environment. I often think boys are sort of much more about like, how do I get out and kind of do things in the world? I also think as much as we put huge attention on girls' education, which I think is important, having two boys and watching boys struggle, the more narrow our schools have become, the more compliance oriented, the more narrow in their definitions of what constitutes smart. I think the more boys have struggled. And I think we see that in disciplinary data and all sorts of other things. And that is especially true of girls of color, boys of color, et cetera, right? Because I think there are also cultural elements to that as well, which is, I don't see myself. But yeah, this idea of like you become what you do. And we've always known that, right? And yet we have decided somehow that kids are better off somehow learning to fit in the box, and then you'll go out into life and somehow be successful. And that seems to me totally backwards, which is you should spend those formative years helping young people develop the skills that developmentally they're ready for, which are often about learning big things about the world, learning about themselves, learning how to relate to other people. When you don't do that, I think we are seeing in all sorts of ways what happens to society, because you have people who don't have some of those really foundational skills and abilities, and we miss the sensitive period of development for that. And then, oh, Sandra, sorry, what do you see as the immediate steps towards achieving your goal of equitable opportunities for the 3 different educational models you described? Yeah, so giving funding challenges. Now see, this is very interesting because the right-hand side column, schools are not more expensive necessarily, right? When you think about the billions of dollars that we're spending on things inside the existing system, there are a lot of right-hand side schools that are operating on much smaller per pupil revenue dollars because they're often not relying on really expensive apps, on really expensive technology, on really expensive whatever. They are seeing young people as assets. They are seeing their community as assets. They are seeing kind of the wider world as an asset. And so they're tapping into things that already exist rather than trying to like build it all into the school. So at least for me, the opportunity right now is one, seeing the distinction, especially between the second and the third buckets, right? Most people conflate those and they're actually really, really different. And then setting up mechanisms, that sort of research and development space, carving that out, carving out time, space for the coalition of the willing, the people who are already in that mindset, to be able to have the time to answer the question, well, what does this mean about what we teach? What does this mean? How is it different for elementary versus for middle school versus for high school? What does this mean for assessing things in different ways that are still, I hate the word rigorous, but that still have some level of quality control and seriousness, right? But aren't about reducing things into numbers and simplified pieces. And those are all super important questions from an educational and equity perspective, but people don't have time to answer those. So I would wish during COVID that there would be a little bit more room, especially as everyone's figuring out their own solutions, which they are right now, right? It's like, my kid's not going to school. How are they going to spend their time? It would be to more formally set up the mechanisms for some of these natural experiments to happen, and to sort of grow out for a couple of years so that we could see, you know, what's different. And I think it would be about, from the get-go, deciding on some of the things we thought were important to measure and starting to measure them. So like student engagement. Am I engaged with my learning? Do I care about my learning? How do I feel about myself? How do I feel about my capacity in these different areas, right? Like asking those questions at the beginning and then seeing what's happening at the end. There are already studies that have done this, but in the way of, people always say evidence-based decision-making. I sort of feel like we have decision-based evidence-making. People decide what decision they want, and then they look at which evidence is gonna help them make that case. They don't look at the data and the evidence that shows, for example, the New York Performance Standards Consortium in the 1980s through the mid-90s did basically a look at, this was mostly kids of color, mostly kids coming from lower income, sort of at promise backgrounds. And the persistence rate, so matriculation rate at post-secondary programs and the persistence rate were like out of the roof better than the traditional schools where kids did the Regents exam and they were definitely better than many of the no excuses charter schools where they often got into college but then failed out miserably after they got there. But nobody looks at that data and they don't point to that data as a reason to do something different. And that's kind of because systems, right? It's the nature of systems. They're designed to self-perpetuate. And the people inside of them, not with bad intention, are part of a system, and their incentive is to kind of keep that system mostly intact, because otherwise they're not relevant in the same way, and that's scary.
I think Ulcca, I think that's probably it, because it looks like a lot of people have had to jump off to go to other meetings, and I will share the chat with you so you can see who was here and their background, because I know you asked for that, so I'll share that with you. But thank you so much, Ulcca. I thought that was so interesting. I learned a lot. I don't have children to educate, but I have nephews who are being educated, so I guess that counts too. But yeah, it's a really interesting, and you know, this current time is such an interesting time to see whether there are ways that we can change these tensions.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for that. Really, really appreciate you for giving us the time to do this, and I will put this all up on our website, and I'll share the link with you, and I'll share the link with others as well so that they can watch that. But thank you very much.
Thank you all,
everybody, for coming. Thank you for coming to the Hangout, and I'm just going to turn off the recording.